A warm welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week, we're learning more about the assassination of the Haitian president, Jovenel Moïse, as police say they have caught a prime suspect and identified a member of the cabinet as one of the masterminds. Then, protests in Cuba draw international attention as President Miguel Diaz-Canel blames U.S. sanctions and interference in his country's affairs for the situation. Our interview this week is with the Director General of the Nigeria Institute for International Affairs, Professor Ehosa Osage, on a number of international issues, including the coronavirus pandemic. That's all coming up ahead. First, a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back. We'll take a short break now. Diplomatic Channel will be right back. The Nigerian ambassador and head of mission to the Gabonese Republic, Ambassador Raymond Brown, has presented his letters of credence to President Ali Bongo of Gabon. Having received the letters and exchanged pleasantries, President Bongo said that Nigeria and Gabon have a lot of work to do in fighting insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea, piracy, terrorism, and Boko Haram insurgency, and other areas of bilateral interests. Ambassador Brown also met with the Gabonese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bakome Mobele Bubeya, and they both discussed the need for cooperation in the fight against insecurity, increased free flow of trade, and the resuscitation of moribund bilateral relations between both countries, as well as a scheduled direct flight to Gabon, considering the huge population of Nigerians in the country. Meanwhile, Ambassador Alex Kefas has also presented his letters of credence as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to Portugal, to President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa of the Republic of Portugal at the Presidential Palace in Lisbon. The ambassador extolled President Buhari's achievements since his assumption of office in 2015 to include successes in the economy, the fight against corruption and insecurity. He also commended the Portuguese government, especially its navy, for attending the yearly Nigerian naval military exercises and hosting its ships for stopovers in Portugal. He called on the Portuguese government to expand the defense cooperation between the two friendly nations to include training of the Nigerian military and other security agencies to tackle the rising security challenges, especially the fight against piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. Finally, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres celebrated Mandela Day on Sunday, July 18, with a message for the world, describing the day as an opportunity to reflect on the life and legacy of a legendary global advocate for dignity, equality, justice, and human rights. He said Madiba's call for solidarity and an end to racism are particularly relevant today as social cohesion around the world is threatened by division.
Nelson Mandela International Day is an opportunity to reflect on the life and legacy of a legendary global advocate for dignity, equality, justice, and human rights. Each year, on this day, Nelson Mandela's birthday, we pay tribute to this extraordinary man who embodied the highest aspirations of the United Nations and the human family. Madiba's calls for solidarity and an end to racism are particularly relevant today as social cohesion around the world is threatened by division. Societies are becoming more polarized, with hate speech on the rise and misinformation blurring the truth, questioning science and undermining democratic institutions. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has made these ills more acute and rolled back years of progress in the global fight against poverty. As always, in times of crisis, it is the marginalized and discriminated against who suffer the most, often while being blamed for problems they did not cause. The pandemic has shown the vital importance of human solidarity and unity, values championed and exemplified by Nelson Mandela in his lifelong fight for justice. No one is safe until all are safe, and each of us has a part to play. Let us be inspired by Madiba's message to each of us that each of us can make a difference in promoting peace, human rights, harmony with nature, and dignity for all. Let us all honor Madiba's call to action and be empowered by his legacy.
Haiti's First Lady Martine Moyes is back in the country after being treated for injuries she sustained on July 7th, the night the president, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated. She was seen at Port-au-Prince airport with a brace on her arm. While 18 of 26 Colombians suspected of playing a role in the attack have been detained, and 3 killed by police, 5 are still on the run. And police say they also have one of the brains behind the operation.
Haiti's interim Prime Minister Claude Joseph says, according to a Colombian police chief, former Justice Ministry official Joseph Felix Badio may have ordered President Moïse's assassination. General George Vargas said an investigation by Haitian and Colombian authorities alongside Interpol into the killing has revealed that Badio appeared to have given an order for the assassination 3 days before the attack. He says investigation found that Badio had ordered former Colombian soldiers Bernie Capardo and German Rivera, who had initially been contacted to carry out security services, to kill the president. He, however, did not provide proof or give more details about where the information came from. Capardo was killed and Rivera captured by Haiti police in the aftermath of Moïse's murder. During the week, General Vargas said former soldiers allegedly linked to the assassination only planned to arrest the president and hand him over to drug enforcement authorities. Colombia's president says many Colombian ex-soldiers accused of involvement in Moïse's assassination went to Haiti to work as bodyguards, but others knew a crime was being planned. Families and colleagues of some of the detainees have told journalists in Colombia that the suspects were hired to work as bodyguards and are innocent. Haitian police detained 63-year-old Christian Emmanuel Sanon, who is widely described as a Florida-based doctor, and accused him of being one of the masterminds behind the plot. The head of security of Haiti's National Palace has been arrested and is in police custody. Leon Charles told a news conference that Dimitri Herard was detained and is being questioned about why the attackers did not meet resistance at the president's home. By Thursday, FBI and Haitian agents searched and collected evidence at the president's home. One eyewitness explains her experience the night of the assassination. She said she was sleeping at midnight when she heard a megaphone with a voice speaking in Creole and another language. She says it was like a dream. Then she heard shots, and then the house started to shake as if there was an earthquake. A U.S. senior administration official says charges could be brought to the United States related to the killing of the president. U.S. President Joe Biden weighed in on Haiti's security, saying that sending troops to Haiti is not on the agenda.
With regard to whether the circumstance in which we would send military troops to Haiti, we're only sending American Marines to our embassy to make sure that they are secure and nothing is out of whack at all. But the idea of sending American forces into Haiti is not on the agenda at this moment.
The anti-government protests that began last Sunday in Cuba are continuing, not just in Cuba, but in countries where Cubans are resident as well. The government still insists international governments are influencing the demonstrations.
The protests are ongoing in Cuba, but authorities are trying to clamp down on information going out, but online independent media has emerged a key factor, with citizens increasingly turning to the web for information outside the traditional state press. The U.S. says it is reviewing whether it can help Cubans regain internet access in the wake of the Cuban government's actions following the protests. The Cuban government has restricted access to social media and messaging platforms, including Facebook and WhatsApp, amid the protests. Cubans have called on the government and protesters to engage in dialogue to prevent a worsening of the political crisis on the Caribbean island, The protests began on Sunday, July the 11th, as people hit the streets to voice their discontent with food shortages, power outages, and worsening economic conditions. The government has said the demonstrations were orchestrated by U.S.-financed counter-revolutionaries, manipulating frustration with an economic crisis largely caused by the decades-old U.S. trade embargo. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel said on Friday the United States, not Cuba, was a failed state, reacting to comments made the previous day by U.S. President Joe Biden in the wake of unprecedented protests on the island. The president has called for peace and solidarity, adding that his government will have to learn from the protests. On Wednesday, his government announced it was temporarily lifting restrictions on the amount of food and medicine travelers could bring into the country in an apparent small concession to demands by protesters. Cubans around the world have been holding similar protests to the ones in Cuba. In Bolivia, protesters gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in La Paz to protest the embargo on Cuba. Outside the Cuban Embassy in Washington, D.C., the message, "Free Cuba," is written in giant block lettering on the street in front in Spanish. It is not clear who was behind the giant lettering, but thousands of Cubans across the United States are protesting issues by demonstrators back home, shortages of basic foods, curbs on civil liberties, and the government's handling of a surge in COVID-19 infections in the most significant unrest in decades in the island nation. A caravan of supporters with protesters departed Miami on Friday evening en route Washington, D.C., where they had planned to demand more action from the U.S. government. Protests have been reported in Mexico, in Argentina, in Spain, and in more places in the United States. Other countries in Latin America have added their voices either in support for the protests or for the Cuban president. Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro blamed the United States for the protests and called for Washington to lift sanctions on the country. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, before he took ill last week, declared his support for the protesters, saying on social media, "All the support and solidarity to the Cuban people today. They bravely call for an end to the cruel dictatorship which for decades has massacred freedom by selling the illusion of a socialist paradise. Let democracy flourish in Cuba and bring better days to its people."
And now to our feature interview. Professor Jose Osagie was appointed Director General of the Nigeria Institute of International Affairs in April this year. He may have been in office for only a few months, but Professor Osagie's leadership comes as Africa's foremost foreign policy think tank turns 60 this year. I had a chat with him on various issues of national and international interests.
One of the key issues in the 1980s, one of those issues helped to not only define but also potentially redefine the global order, structural adjustment. And the Bretton Woods institutions were very clear, that structural adjustment was the way to go. We needed to have the state in recession, and so on. Agencies like the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, in partnership with the NIA and a few other progressive agencies across the continent, decided it was time to not simply challenge, but also formulate some alternative framework, for understanding African, economic development and the kinds of challenges that had come in the 1980s that necessitated a structural adjustment. So the point was, yes, we needed structural adjustment, but we didn't quite agree with what the IMF and the World Bank were saying. So we developed an African alternative framework for structural adjustment, or even to think of the Lagos Plan of Action. These are, key points, in the African development trajectory that directly challenged conventional wisdom.
It sounds like the NIA is reinventing itself. I mean, it's been providing this, playing this advisory role to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So where is its pivot in Nigeria's foreign policy?
Well, I mean, foreign policy is a whole process, like every policy process else. What you see at the end emerge as policy. It doesn't always tell you what has gone in as input to policy. It is not in every policy, of course, that you would find the NIA. What the NIA does is on tap, not on top. NIA serves policy. It's a think tank, that feeds policy, more or less. So the NIA has been there all the time. And when you say you haven't found any clear definition of that foreign policy posture, you probably have in mind the kinds of things that to say in the past, things like, their traditional principles and the pivots that you talked about, that Africa is the centerpiece of Nigeria's foreign policy. The point about, restructuring is that when we use the term, it looks like we want to have fundamental reinventions. But restructuring is in the nature of the things that we do. So even if we didn't, calibrate it and say this is restructuring, that's been going on all the time. We say, that the one thing that doesn't change much is your national interest. Your national interest is your anchor, for processing, for engaging, and for relating with the rest of the world. And if you go around Africa, you would find that it is difficult to define Nigeria's national interest outside of the African context. So to say that Africa remains, the centerpiece of our foreign policy is a correct description. It's a correct anchor. Many times you go around, the continent, you are even outside the continent, and you find people saying, we haven't heard from Nigeria. Yeah, so until Nigeria has spoken, Africa has not spoken. There is a dilemma, there are policy dilemmas we have. What is Nigeria's position? People want to know. That's something that in the past, we used to describe, in the language of Nigeria's manifest destiny.
Nigeria's voice, which you've talked about, has been missing in a few events, especially on the continent. For example, with Morocco's intending membership of the ECOWAS, the day that meeting held in Liberia, Nigeria was not present. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs said, Nigeria has no problems with Morocco, which is a North African country, joining the ECOWAS.
These things are up for review all the time. Morocco's aspirations, to move from the sphere of North Africa into West Africa, it's what it is, an aspiration. Morocco is looking for new vistas, of engagement. Morocco appears to have issues with its North African, fellows. So that's something that Nigeria cannot decide alone. ECOWAS is what it is. ECOWAS is an organization that thrives on, first and foremost, the principle of equality of nations. We all have, our voices, but there is collective decision making. So it's something that, ECOWAS will continue to consider for some time. And Nigeria cannot impose its will on ECOWAS, on matters like that, as you very well know. When it happened in Liberia, you forget that, even at the beginning when the OAU was to be founded, we had those blocks. We can have blocks, it's legitimate, it's all right to do so. But once the Nigerian position becomes very clearly asserted, we'll do so.
2020 was a pretty challenging year for many countries, including Nigeria. The pandemic hit, and everybody was thrown, off balance. Diplomacy took a hit, so did global politics. It exposed the flailing health infrastructures the countries have. How would you describe Nigeria's handling of the pandemic 1 year after?
Well, there's always the benefit of hindsight. It caught everyone unawares. I mean, that's the first thing. It was like, what you might describe as, a shock. I mean, it took many countries a long time to recover from the shock. So we're not alone. But, what it did was to expose the underbelly, of the undercapacities that many countries in the world had. I mean, the materials, that were then in very high demand, such as, the personal protection, things, those things, the PPEs, ran out. I mean, even the UK itself, had to, begin to ask for imports from Turkey, from India, and from all of those places. There were medicines that, not many people thought of, which even America, had to, appeal to India to consider, supplying and so on. I think it was a time the whole world, needed to come back beyond the initial shock, and begin to use the capacities, and that's where differences started to show.
But we had great success with, the Ebola epidemic, because it wasn't a pandemic, Ebola epidemic, and it just seemed like, we would naturally take a lead.
The scale of Ebola was not, as global as this. See, at the point, even the scientists themselves were not quite sure, what we were fighting. Today, I don't think, any country can beat its chest to say we now know for certain, the things we need to know about COVID-19. We're still talking about new strains. We're still talking about, what factors, the variants, and people are still questioning the origins, the sources of all of these things. So I think all together, it's a time that shows our shared humanity. That all of us should come together, and this is the point, about a unified approach. Can be continental, can be sub-regional, can be global, but whatever it is clear that no country can fight the pandemic acting alone.
For Nigeria, being Africa's largest economy and being Africa's leader, there were expectations that, Nigeria would lead, especially in the vaccine campaign. Do you think that we met up with expectations?
Right now, there is talk of building up, shoring up our capacities for vaccine production. There is talk of, getting us to be not just consumers of vaccines, but, producers also. Remember that up until the 1990s, we produced yellow fever vaccines in Nigeria. Yes, we did. I mean, so the science of vaccine production is not a monopoly of any country.
And that's it on Diplomatic Channel. I hope you will join us again next time. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Thanks for watching.